What's up, Rufus Nation? I'm sick as hell, so sorry if I'm not as animated in this video as some of my other rants, and the same logic applies to the rants that are soon to come, because I'm really sick and I'm not sure when I'm going to get better. So sorry about that in advance, and sorry if there's any cuts in this rant, because it's probably a cut for when I had to cough. But today I'm going to be ranting about the first episode of Star Trek, as per the request of Trey on Patreon, and it was definitely a very interesting episode. I came into this totally blind, but growing up, I had always heard about Star Trek, in particular how ahead of its time it was, not only, in terms of like the technology presented within the show, but more so in terms of, the special effects, the practical effects, the the political undertones of the story. There were a lot of things that supposedly happened in Star Trek that were very much ahead of their time, that a lot of people have always been very impressed by. And I can see how the show is going out to be ambitious and to try new things from this very first episode alone. There are these skyboxes they do for foreign planets that are just like bright red. The sky is bright red, and it totally changes the whole palette of the scene, and it looks really interesting. They go for a bunch of interesting shots and shot compositions that I'm going to go over in just a second. And just overall, it's a very interesting episode that tries to do a lot of cool things. So to start off, the episode is a shapeshifter story. So there is an entity which eventually the crew stumbles upon, which, unbeknownst to them at the beginning of the episode, has the ability to transform its appearance into whatever its observer would find the most comforting and appealing. Typically, whatever the observer's romantic interest or partner is, dead or alive, that is what the being will appear as. And if multiple people are looking at it at the same time, multiple people, each person, will be seeing a different thing at the same time, which makes for some very interesting shots where the character's one character in one frame, and then they flip the frame over partially, and then they're an entirely different character, and they sort of walk in and out of the frame as different characters. It's very, very interesting, very, very unique, and that's one of the things that I remember the most. I almost just coughed there. Essentially, a lot of the episode revolves around this entity slowly picking off members of the crew over time as they scramble to try to figure out what the hell is going on. I try not to critique things about a show that just weren't what they were going for, but so don't take this as a criticism and take it with a grain of salt. But I would have found it very interesting if the audience was sort of put in a similar situation to the crew, and that they had to try to figure out what was happening instead of it being communicated to them. But I don't necessarily think that'd be better. It's just something I'd be interested to potentially see a plot along the lines of in the future. What happens is they're slowly picked off one by one. They start exhibiting strange symptoms. This entity is continuously eluding their search. They keep trying to find it. They get more and more desperate as it goes on, as it encounters more and more people. And this creature has a bizarre dependence on salt. It needs salt to live, so how it ends up killing the crewmates is by draining the salt out of their body, which is pretty brutal. And basically that's how it stays alive. That's how it stays beautiful. And it is the last member of its species, to my memory. So this is pretty important, pretty high stakes stuff for this this creature that we're talking about here. And basically, it makes some questionable decisions. You're not you when you're hungry. You're not you when you haven't had your salt in a while. But generally maintains its trickery throughout the entire runtime of the episode, and eventually is stopped by the iron nerves of Oh man, I don't remember his name. Captain Kirk always had iron nerves. He was always able to put mind over matter and, shoot the beast even when it looked like somebody who he cared for. But he had to convince his friend, not his friend, his general or marshal or whatever ranking officer it was, one of the members of his fleet he had to convince to finally put mind over matter and shoot the creature which looks like the woman that he once loved. So this is basically the push and pull of the entire episode. It brings up interesting thematic concepts. I like to think of the fact that it is different for every single person that is observing it. So I'm not even sure exactly. It's a little bit unclear, and it's a little bit confusing, but I'm not sure exactly how intelligent this creature is supposed to be, but it largely stays the same. I don't think it necessarily has to do anything for its, powers of trickery to be in effect. It's just when people observe it, they happen to observe it as different things, and it doesn't actually change its material form in any sort of way. So what happens is you have this thing that everybody gets something different out of, but in reality, it just wants salt. Everybody has all of these deep, complex, emotional ties to it, and this thing's just trying to get its salt and, live forever, carry on the legacy of its species. I don't even know if it's intelligent enough to have that sort of a motivation, but this thing just wants to keep living, keep eating salt, and, get out of harm's way, pretty much. It's very interesting to think about as sort of a metaphor for, oh gosh, well, I feel like I always fall into talking about these kinds of things, but, it is sort of a la, for lack of a better term, a parasocial relationship, any one-way relationship, which have obviously become much more prominent in recent years with the rise of the internet. It's interesting that so many people are trying to get out of this one entity different things. Well, it's usually always that they just derive, some sort of a sense of profound comfort or emotional security around them, or it's just like it's bringing back someone they love from the dead. And everybody's able to get something unique out of this one being. It definitely sets an interesting precedent for the series by showing the fleet put in a great deal of danger. Like, they almost get severely screwed over by this thing, and its main goal isn't even to do so. Its main goal is just to eat salt and survive. It's not all that intelligent of a being. So it's very interesting that the crew was so vulnerable to something like this. Some sort of thing coming from the inside, a double agent. The crew is, exceptionally vulnerable to this, as we learned from this episode. So it's definitely an interesting thing to think going forward. I like that the first episode introduces this sort of doubt, and now for the rest of the series, if I were to continue watching it, I'm sure in the back of my mind I'd be wondering if there's anybody who isn't who they say they are, or anybody who's not being truthful with their motivations. That's pretty much all I have to say about this episode. I found it to be very enjoyable. I thought a lot of the practical effects and the fight choreography was pretty silly. I got introduced to a lot of the most iconic characters of the series, obviously Captain Kirk, Spock, all those blokes, and that was pretty cool. So yeah, overall, I liked it. I think it set an interesting precedent for the series, and I think it represents a little bit of an interesting concept, and I thought it was cool how it also pursued a lot of ambitious and unique directorial techniques. That's about it. I love you, Rufus Nation. I'm dying of a cough right now. It's so bad. Goodbye.